A note of warning. This podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing.
Our guest this week is author Jan Burke, mystery crime writer and best-selling author who has written 15 books, and you advocate for advances in forensic science. We talked a little bit about this in our weekly podcast, and we're doing a little bit of a web extra so we can take a deeper dive into forensics and specifically the government database known as NamUs, which is NamUs.gov. It's NamUs.gov. So first of all, we talked a little bit about how you got into the game. You were a crime writer, and you have to have a certain amount of verisimilitude. You have to have details that make sense to people who know if you're gonna write crime fiction, right, you better get your details right. And so that led you into what was it? The National Institute of the National Institute of Justice.
I have spoken for the National Institute of Justice and for the American Academy of Forensic Science, and at the American Society of Crime Lab Directors was the one that I had mentioned earlier. That's all. I should maybe plug in a little bit of the personal side of all this as well. When I was in college, 2 of my cousins went missing. And it wasn't a mysterious missing kind of case of where they had gone out hunting on a winter day on a lake, didn't come back. The lake froze over, and they couldn't be found, but the boat was found, and so the assumption was that the boat had overturned. And was
that here in California?
This was in Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, gotcha.
And their bodies could not be recovered immediately. So seeing what that did though to the family, to not know for certain, to not have. That, people talk of closure. I'm not sure I'm a believer in closure at this point, but at least
knowledge of
it's very important in our culture for people to have remains to bury, or just have some kind of disposition of them. We don't do death very well in general, but that was hard. And my aunt was imagining, well, what if they were kidnapped? What if they really need our help? What if something else had happened?
Yeah, the imagination
and we're
goes
not
wild.
pursuing it. What if they need us? And almost every family of missing persons that I've talked to goes through this kind of nightmare. In some ways, it is worse than a murder.
Right.
Because there's just the human imagination.
Right.
You're
going to think the worst.
Right. And then, of course, there are stories that come along once in a while of someone who's been held captive in Northern California or something.
Right.
So it is, hope can almost torture people in some ways. So we have sort of that pillar in NamUs is the families of the missing. The other thing that became very obvious as forensic science made strides, and we had DNA and we had all of these ways, and we started using computers for everything from fingerprints to DNA databases, that the unidentified dead were not really being connected up between jurisdictions.
They were staying unidentified.
Right, right. And it's been called the nation's silent mass disaster because it's believed there are well over 500,000 people unidentified and their remains unidentified in various jurisdictions across the country. So when I was doing my original forensic science work, I kept doing stuff with the federal government. We made some strides, but eventually I realized we had set things up in our country based on coroner's laws from the 10th century in England. We had gone with counties which were often established on the basis of how far could you ride a horse in one day, and that's your unit of government. So the changes needed to happen at a whole different level. And the biggest level I could go to was the state level. So I started looking at how states manage these unidentified remains, and who are the people that are in charge of them. And the people who are in charge of them are going to be what's known as the medical legal death investigator. That's going to be the coroner or the ME. And as I've said, there's no legal definition throughout the United States. Like, everyone has agreed that this is what an ME is and what an ME's qualifications are. Some people believe that an ME has to be a doctor. That's not true. It all is just how each state sets up its laws. So what we have with NamUs is some people who were concerned said, let's have a database and people can contribute to this, and the government is providing all kinds of support to local jurisdictions. They'll help with forensic anthropology. They'll help with DNA. Families can submit DNA to NamUs with the missing persons case. They don't require police to give, say, all the case details, but the police can put in enough information where someone who might know more. Because if you stop to think about finding a set of remains, let's suppose there's some sign of violence or some sign of this being a homicide. You can't do much with a case until you know who your victim is. So putting a name to a victim is a big part of this problem with these cases. Is people just don't know where to go. So if a killer takes the identification of the person or they didn't have it with them, then, and they're not from that very jurisdiction where they're found, then you're going to have trouble. It can also be accidental deaths. Someone falls into a river on a hiking trip.
Exactly, drowning or something like that. You might have your belongings are swept away.
Exactly.
Whatever the case may be.
When I first started talking about this, one day I was, as I said, speaking at book signings. One of the members of the audience stood up and said, "I know what you're talking about. My adult son was missing for 10 years, and what had happened is he had gone out hiking the next county over from where she lived. She files a missing persons report in her county. He fell off a cliff on his hiking trip in the next county over, but there was no computer system connecting the unidentified body.
Right.
10 years, he was found actually about a week after he disappeared. But
the agencies hadn't talked to each other about this and weren't communicating.
No way it is. So finally, 10 years later, someone used fingerprints and identified him. So she waited those 10 years wondering what had happened to her son. It's just being tortured by this. So this is the kind of thing that pushes me to do this work.
Even before, talk about a little bit about NamUs and the infrastructure of doing this state by state by state. But even in a situation like that, it seems like the first obvious thing would be dental records, but fingerprints, right? Like, wouldn't you? Although if you don't have a criminal record,
right,
or you worked in some federal capacity or something, there's probably nothing on record.
Right. But if you've got the fingerprints in County B and they never leave County B, and County A has the missing persons report, and maybe he even worked at a job with it, and nobody's connecting the two cases. So the beauty of NamUs is the ability to connect the missing persons reports, the family's quest for the missing person, with the data in these various death investigators' offices. So
this free database, and we encourage our viewers and listeners to go to NamUs.gov, check it out. There's you can sort of go on and you register as a user and you sort of do a dashboard type of interface type of thing. Two entities are coming to this site or to this database. You've got law enforcement agencies and you've got what basically essentially individuals who say, I either have somebody in my family or friends that may be missing, or I just want to put my stuff into the database for to help, whatever the case is. So this is some of this site is engineered specifically for the public, for individuals to go ahead and put this stuff in there.
That's the power of it, really.
Right.
You're right, is that it's publicly
sort of group
accessible.
sourcing, open sourcing this stuff.
And the sort of third component of that is the coroners and medical examiners' offices. And the weakness in it all has been that there have not been state laws mandating that those individuals report to NamUs.
That you enter all this stuff that you have in your own files into this database.
Right.
And is that dragging feet, or is it more? Is it your impression that it's more like just it hasn't been part of the procedural thing enough that people, they're not aware of it, or is that essentially what it is?
I think in part it's awareness, and part of it is that the people who are taking on these jobs are often not trained for a lot of things, but they're people, I think, of goodwill who are doing a tough job. Many of them see it as an administrative job, and it is to some degree. But it's also the way in which a family is going to have this kind of case resolved. So I ranted about this on Facebook one day, and a New York legislator, I didn't realize this, but a family friend, I didn't realize she'd married a New York state legislator, Steve Otis. Steve Otis said, let's pass this law. He got bipartisan total support for it. So New York became the first state to mandate NamUs reporting, and to mandate later they also mandated missing persons. And we add Tennessee. We're up to 9 states now. So I would like to encourage anybody who doesn't live in one of the states I'm about to name, New York, Tennessee, Michigan, New Mexico, West Virginia, Illinois, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and as of October 1st, North Carolina. You are all, please write to your legislators and praise them for mandating NamUs reports if you are in those states. And if you aren't in those states, get a hold of your legislators and say, we have to mandate reporting of unidentified remains, because it's going to solve these murder cases. It's going to solve missing persons cases. It's going to give families some closure of knowing what happened. Within just a few weeks of the first law passing in New York, a young man from Kentucky who had gone hiking, who fell into a river, they had no idea who he was. He was in the Rochester, New York area.
Yeah, how
no
would you
connection.
Why would you even think that?
Right,
exactly.
right. But that's how that family learned what had happened to their son.
This story that you sent me the other day as well, a similar story to both of these that you're talking about, one North Carolina case, which, by the way, North Carolina was the one that just joined. And again, it's kind of shocking, but it sort of makes sense. It's time to get it going. But only 9 out of 50 states is kind of crazy. But a woman was reported missing in Charlotte in 1975. Skeletal remains found in 1985, but not officially identified until October last year, when her sister actually put her own DNA into the thing. Which, okay, that makes sense, because it's unfortunate, but that familial relative hadn't entered that information to begin with. But on the other end is, even if you've got some states, they've got all that information, it's sitting on the shelf, it just hasn't made it into this national database where it could do a lot of good.
Right.
For all sorts of reasons. So this has to be sort of mandated at the state level, though. You have to get this.
Right. It has to be at
legally.
the state level, because state by state is how those laws about death investigation are established. There's no, it's part of what's reserved to the states versus what the federal government has the power to do. The federal government could maybe withhold funding to people or something,
Right.
but it's really
That gray area between states'
right.
rights and federal. Yeah, gotcha.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, you don't necessarily have to be a family member. Friends, if you're missing a friend, and there's, I know you had mentioned the Manson case. There's sort of a Manson family connection to all of this.
Yeah, talk about
in
that.
1969, a body was found out in the hills in L.A., a woman with multiple stab wounds, no identification. She seemed to match some of the kinds of cases that were being connected with Charles Manson. For a long, the family style, we'll say. So for a long time, police wondered if she was yet another of their victims, but they had really, no way back at that point to identify her. Many, many years later, I think this was in 2016, if I recall correctly, a woman in Canada wondered what had happened to her friend Reet, who his parents had immigrated to Canada. Reet had decided to go down to Los Angeles with a boyfriend, if I remember the details correctly, and hadn't been heard from other than a postcard she had sent this friend, and I guess a family member got one, her sister got one as well or something. So they knew she was in the Los Angeles area, and then she just stopped communicating with the family. Nobody really knew what had become of her. So her friends started looking through NamUs. And around this time, the LAPD had loaded up her case to NamUs as a complete long shot that someone was going to know about this over 40 years
Right. Why not, though?
later, this friend saw her friend Reet Jerson on NamUs. And that allowed the police to make more connections with. From that, they learned not only who she was, but when she arrived in L.A.,
Follow
where
up
she had
leads and
been,
details,
who had
right.
been around her, all of that. So, yeah, it's an amazing tool, and we just need to make sure it gets our support.
And it's often those kind of just small, minor, mundane details like that all it really takes to break a case for investigators. Just need one lead that leads to a thing. We've got a dead end. That's the case here. This free database, I'm struck by, you've got free forensic services that NamUs does, including investigative support. If you've
Right.
got I'm impressed by that from seasoned staff. But you've also got basically forensic dentistry. So you've got the dental patterns, dental records, fingerprint exams, forensic anthropology, and DNA analysis. Forensic anthropology, I guess, would be bones themselves, like
Right.
sort of an
So
archaeology.
if a coroner has a set of bones, and they have, and quite often coroners have no forensic science background whatsoever.
Which blows my mind.
They can send the remains to NamUs. They can arrange with NamUs to have a forensic anthropologist examine those, because a forensic anthropologist can learn a lot from a set of bones. You can learn stature, usually. Gender,
relative health,
sex,
even things
right,
like that. Sure,
right.
absolutely.
Right. So relative age,
Right.
possible what they would call phenotype, or what a
Sure.
person may have looked like. NamUs also has forensic artists. So they have people who can work with, say, a skull, and through various measurements, likely what the person may have looked like,
Right.
In life. So those are all, amazing tools. And your average coroner is not going to necessarily have access to all of that. They may or may not, but NamUs definitely offers this, without charge to them.
So, yeah, that brings to mind the question of you've talked about jurisdiction to jurisdiction and state to state, how they certify their medical examiner or the coroner or whatever the title may be in that case. So if you've got somebody who's basically an elected official or appointed official and doesn't have any science background or much more than a seminar training, 50 hours of training or something like that, is that how do they function? Do they say basically to use TV shorthand, they send it off to the lab. If we're talking about a rural jurisdiction, or we're talking about a place with less funds, are they sending this kind of stuff to a bigger city, or are they basically opting into this NamUs system to get that sort of third-party work done? Do you have an idea about that?
Well, all kinds of things happen. I've seen jurisdictions where the coroner's office was in a small room over a bridal shop, and the bereaved had to walk upstairs through a bridal shop. No refrigeration. This was in the South, by the way. No refrigeration unit. Mm-hmm. So if unidentified remains are found out near this jurisdiction, I can guarantee you that the likelihood is that as soon as possible, those remains are going to be cremated and buried in a pauper's field. And sorry, John Doe, Jane Doe, we don't know who you are. I mean, every year in Los Angeles, this doesn't just happen in small places. Every year in Los Angeles, which has a relatively good system, there's a mass burial of unidentified remains because these offices can't warehouse as many remains as come in. So there's several levels of problems. One is, since 1920, the National Academies of Sciences has said we should be on a medical examiner system throughout the country. In other words, the people who hold this job should be forensic pathologists trained in forensic pathology, which is not even pathologists. Like in some places, they'll take them over to the local hospital, and the pathologist at the hospital is a disease-based person. They're not necessarily someone who's going to be looking for forensic evidence. They may or may not ever x-ray. They may not even have real protocol set down for what you do in this kind of case. So part of what I'm hoping will happen is that we will at least get to the point, if you're not going to go to a medical examiner system, if we're not going to do something like what we need to do really is fund public service forensic pathology training, so we up the number of available forensic pathologists because that's an increasingly low number of people. Insist that our states come into the 21st century, have people who know what they're doing in charge of this. Do it regionally because the individual counties cannot afford this, especially in areas where there's not much population. The tax base isn't there to support a forensic pathologist. So give these people regional medical examiners' offices or state medical examiners' offices. Have somebody who's got medical and forensic training and legal training doing all of this. Submit everything you can to NamUs if you don't have an answer. Have someone who knows how to use other federal databases like VICAP and so on in some cases. Do this for the families, but also we often don't think about everything that in our lives that's affected by a coroner or a medical examiner. Public safety. Product safety, disease outbreaks, drug. People talk about OxyContin.
Sure. The opioid crisis,
and
like you say,
they're public health. So many areas. People think of this as the office for dead people. It's for the living. Everything that comes out of a coroner's office. If it was just the dead people, we wouldn't care.
You bring up a good point, particularly the opioid thing, as well as we're sort of seeing a weird resurgence about vaccinations and things like that. That's a public health issue, and if I want to go to a sort of a mainstay of information, that's what I would imagine would be the place to go locally or regionally to get information on that. It does kind of boggle the mind that we're in 2019 and that's not something that has been formally set up. So yes, by all means, if you're listening, put a little pressure on your local or your state politics. May I ask, what happened to the Oklahoma relatives?
What happened to the Oklahoma?
Did you ever find out what happened to those missing?
My cousins? Yes, in the spring they recovered the bodies.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Which was awful on the one hand, but as I grew older and started seeing these cases and talking to people who went, as the person in the story from North Carolina we just talked about, went from 1985 until now, they didn't have that stretch of time.
Yeah.
So, yes, it was a horrible winter waiting for that spring.
Yeah.
It was a horrible thing to find in the spring, but they had, at least that family had
They knew
that
what happened.
resolution.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, like we've talked about, those are sort of the steps that individuals who care about this, you encourage to take a little action at the government level, but also individually go investigate NamUs.gov and kind of enter your own information and let's sort of crowdsource or open source crowdsource this entire situation here. The more information is always going to be better.
I really appreciate the support of you and the watchers and listeners,
Yeah, we're happy to do it.
because this is the kind of thing that makes a difference. Like I said, we got a New York law and 9 other laws out of a Facebook post. So start speaking up about this.
Yeah. It's only 9 out of 50 states and not including the others. So, I that was shocking to me, and I'm surprised to learn that. So definitely glad that we can help get that information out there. Well, thank you very much, Jan. I appreciate you being with us this weekend
Thank
for
you.
our podcast as well as this web extra. That's Jan Burke. We will have her contact information in our comment section and the information section of our podcast. Once again, thanks, Jan Burke, for being with us.
Thank you.
Until next week.